So this photo by French photographer Eugene Atget was taken with a view camera. And we're going to talk a little bit about a view camera. But a view camera was very, very large at this time, right? The early cameras were enormous. So he would go around the Paris streets with this enormous camera with bellows that needed to that had glass negatives. And he would do street photography. So anytime you're not happy with your technology today, all we have to do is think of Atget and him, really kind of schlepping this camera all the right way around Paris. He really is probably one of the first street photographers. And this picture of the organ grinder is very famous. And it's one that we refer back to in this genre. And this is what I would call a performative portrait. So this was, we believe this was the photographer's daughter. We don't know for sure, but there's a lot of documentation that says that she might be. And so she would sing with the organ grinder, for money. This was their job. So they were performers. And they were used to having people look at them. And I point this out because people who perform, people who have an interesting sense of fashion or style might be good subjects for you, because anyone who sort of can present themselves in such a way is probably not going to be afraid of the camera. They're probably not going to care if you take their picture. So it's sometimes interesting, when we're walking down the street to see who jumps out at us. But if you were, in Paris in 1899 and you saw these two, they would probably stand out a lot. There's a lot of sound coming from them. So there's the organ, there's the singing, there's sort of the calls that they would have made to patrons to see if they can get people, to sing, if they could sing for people. So they were sort of like, almost like what you'd see at a baseball game, somebody selling popcorn or soda. So they'd have calls that they would say. And one of the other interesting things about this is gesture. And gesture is extremely important to, it can make a picture that's just a snapshot into a composition that's worth revisiting again and again. And so here we've got the organ grinder, and his posture, he's looking out at us. This is also sort of a confrontational portrait. This subject is aware that we are taking, his pictures. The little girl is just joyous. She's singing, she's joyful, and she has a different posture. She's expressing herself by the curve in her back and her head being thrown back. So what does that say about this scene? Well, it says that these people are engaged in an activity. They're engaged in something that's meaningful and interesting. And I think that whenever we're out on the street and we're looking to take pictures, it's important to sort of, look for people who are doing activities or, riding bikes, because anything can happen when you're kind of following someone who's doing something. So doing something is very important for street photography. You can get passersby, and that can be interesting too. But if you want to add another layer to the pictures, I think activity is one place to look. So I apologize for the quality of my flaneur, but so street photography is rooted in this idea of the flaneur, which comes out of, the last part of the 19th century in France. And the flaneur is sort of the man about town. He is the observer. I believe flaneur means to stroll. So all of these sort of dandies would get dressed up in their finery and they would stroll the city. many times without their wives. Many times their wives were left home because the flaneur was someone in society who could access places that other people couldn't because of their social stature. So these are upper class men for the most part. And they would visit restaurants and bistros, and they would go to the opera, which at the time wasn't always an opera. Many times the opera was sort of a euphemism for whorehouse. They would also visit women of the evening, and a lot of them were very friendly with them. So the flaneur is sort of this person who is very much of the city. You know, he's absolutely the opposite of provincial. You know, he is urban. He knows the landscape. He spends many hours walking through this terrain and this scape, and he knows it very well. He's respected in the community, and he has this dark side. You know, a number of them would visit prostitutes, use prostitutes. Many of them would spend their nights, drinking away in the cafes and listening to music and things like that, again, while their wives and their families were home. And an example of this would be James McNeill Whistler, the painter. He was sort of a known flaneur. And so was Edward Manet. And Manet is particularly interesting because he also painted what the flaneur would see. He would paint the insides of bars and, all of these places that he would see at night. Because the flaneurs were, certainly out in the day, but they loved to be out at night. So this is a person that sort of becomes the street photographer of today. This is someone who went to places that may not have been the most reputable, but made themselves sort of at home in a multitude of locations. And I love to look back at this painting, which is the Rainy Day Street Scene by Caillebotte. And, this is a flaneur. We are looking at the picture of a flaneur. And there are many of them, right? These are men just, walking around Paris. And Caillebotte was very, very influenced by the camera at the time. So this painting, I would say, probably wouldn't have been painted if photography didn't exist. Because what's happening here is this is sort of a copy of how the camera sees. And we've got a couple in the foreground who are clear. We can see their faces clearly. We can see their expressions. But as the depth of field gets deeper, the people begin to blur. And then when we finally get to the buildings in the square, the buildings are blurry. So in most painting around this time, you'd probably see the entire scene completely sharp. So that's how we know that this is something that was based in camera. And it was known that he worked with photographers as well. So I think this is an interesting way to kind of, start off talking about the history of street photography, is that it's very, very linked with painting. And I think photography in general has always been sort of the ugly stepchild to painting, but there are so many links and there are so many references in street photography to painting and vice versa that it's hard to sort of separate the two. Has everyone seen this picture before? It's in the Chicago Institute of Art. So if you ever get to Chicago, it's worthwhile. It's large. I think it's like 90 inches wide or something like that. So it's a fairly large painting. And also I want to point out in this is composition. So, and we're going to talk about composition with some other pictures today, but this is a very well composed scene. So obviously Caillebotte went to this location and was able to sort of sketch and draw from what he saw and sort of record what the flow of people would be like, and then arrange that in a way that would work in a painting. And so we see we've got we've got a lot of diagonals in this, right? We've got a lot of geometry happening here. And that's something that you can look for when you're taking pictures. Certainly use the architecture that's around you. We've got two streets that are receding, going back behind the building. That's sort of in the upper left. We've got the sky pushing down on that. We have the cobblestone street right in front of us, and the sidewalk, which also are diagonal. So, when you have a diagonal in a photo or in a painting, that usually sort of gives us a sense of motion and depth. So if you're looking, if you're taking pictures and you feel like they're very flat. So one thing you might want to look for is where the diagonals are in the area where you're working. So you can look up a street and there's a diagonal, right? Also, the beach can be used that way. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? But the flaneur is a really interesting, he's an interesting character. And I think that the characters that we see today in street photography, I just talked about Bruce Gilden, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Certainly Gary Winogrand, another one that we'll talk about. But these were people who were characters. Diane Arbus, a character. I studied with Diane Arbus's daughter, and she had a lot to say about Diane herself and how she did her work, but she was very much a character. And I think one of the things that we see in what I would call, the premier artist in street photography is that it's a very sort of solitary pursuit. And a lot of people who do this are very, are characters themselves and are very much, sort of concerned with what's happening socially around them. So I thought this was interesting to see what the square looks like today. And I'll flip back, because what's interesting is, you can see that Kaivat's, he's adjusted the buildings. He's also painting this as if he has a wide angle lens. And this was probably shot with a phone, which is also wide angle, but you can see the adjustments that have been made to this scene so that it becomes more of a composition. Any questions, any comments? Just interrupt me, feel free. So this is a view camera. And I'd like to show this because this is what Atget was, taking with him around Paris. So it has the bellows, it has a lens, it has a shutter. Everything on this camera was handmade. Everything on this camera was manual. So whereas now we could just take our phones or our cameras out and put them on automatic and take a picture, there was a lot more time involved in taking a picture when street photography first started. So imagine the time commitment that the photographer had to make when they were using this camera. These cameras, you couldn't just shoot somebody at a very high shutter speed. So high shutter speed would mean that, high shutter speed is like, done, shutter opens and it closes. In this case, when you're using a view camera, the shutter has to stay open longer to let more light in. And so people had to stay still, and they had to stay with you for quite a while. So the photographer would see someone that he or she wanted to photograph, and then would have to work with those people, arrange them somewhat, and then set the camera up and take a very limited number of pictures, because these were shot on glass plate negatives. So not only was the photographer carrying around this camera that had to be set up and put away when it, there were also glass plate negatives that needed to be stored and that needed to be protected. And then, removed once the negative was exposed. What else was I going to say about the view camera? So the view camera today, many photographers still use them, but they don't use them for street photography. They're used in a lot of fine art work. I think a lot of, there's a number of photographers that you'll see in publications like Vanity Fair, the New York Times, that still use view cameras and take a lot of celebrity portraits or author portraits with them. They're beautiful cameras, and they're just not suited for street photography at all. And another thing about the view camera is when, so there's a hood, right? So you would go behind the camera, behind this bellows all the way in the back, and you put a hood over your head. And when you looked through the glass and through the lens, so you're seeing exactly what you're shooting, but you're seeing it upside down. So it's upside down and reversed. I think it's upside down and reversed. And so you'd be composing using a different side of your brain. And I think that's my point with this. Like, a lot of us are just looking and we're kind of right-brained when we're using our cameras because it's easy. But if you try to shoot something upside down, you're sort of forced to use your left side of your brain and really kind of compose and see things very differently. So I urge all of you to make prints of your photographs, or at the very least, bring them into Photoshop and flip them upside down and see what they look like. Because a lot of times you can see flaws in a picture or maybe things in the composition, elements in the composition that maybe could have been considered a little bit more, but you might see that more easily upside down. So there's a benefit to looking upside down at your scene or your pictures. So this is just a schematic of a view camera. So there was the ground glass, film plane, lens, and so you would adjust the bellows depending on what sort of focal length you wanted. You could gain focal length by actually physically moving the bellows. Any questions? Robert, do you have anything to add? Let me know. I'm just going to kind of gloss over this, not my area of expertise, but if you have some science to add, that's great.
No, I mean, you're doing a fabulous job.
Thank you. Well, lucky for us, along came the Leica, along came the Kodak first. But then after the Kodak came out, along came Leica. And the Leica became the go-to camera for street photographers. So probably the most famous street photographer of the 20th century is the Frenchman Henri Cartier-Bresson. And Bresson used a Leica, and he used a very early Leica, similar to the one that you're seeing at the top. And he later switched to a more modern version of the M. This would be an M3, I believe, on the lower right. And the benefit to this, I think, is kind of obvious, right? This was easy to use, much easier to use. It's still all manual, but it's much lighter. You can take more than one picture in a sequence. You have a relatively quick advance with this camera. Of course, you're still advancing film manually with your finger using this. So it is all manual. But what that does is it forces the photographer to slow down. And I think that in street photography today, when we go out and we take pictures, we are so used to doing things so quickly with our phones or with, the cameras that we have today. They're just very easy to use. And I think that the benefit to using something like this is it really makes you look at the scene that you're working with, and it really makes you slow down. And I would urge everyone to slow down and sort of consider the places that you're shooting in and really getting a feel for that location. What's going on in that location? Where are people moving to and from? Are there businesses there? What kind of colors are part of the location? Because I feel like most places have their own color palettes. So all of that could be considered. Well, we're shooting in black and white with these cameras, but all of that could be considered. So we're thinking a lot about shape. Cartier-Bresson is thinking about shape. He's thinking about light and dark, and he's thinking about activity. and he's thinking about how to capture the people in his neighborhood and in his native France. So he's taking pictures of really commonplace situations, interactions. He's taking pictures of the young boy on the bicycle. He's taking pictures of the schoolgirls walking to school. So he's using these kinds of cameras to capture what is sort of the opposite of painting, right? At this time. So painting, we're probably taking people and elevating them through painting. And we're painting kings and queens and all kinds of people of high status. Manet comes along and he starts to paint people who are very common in his neighborhood, musicians. And he paints them very much the way a photograph might photograph them. So we sort of have this overlap of Manet, Cartier-Bresson, and people like that who are becoming very interested in sort of lowbrow, what I might call lowbrow or very local life. Any questions? Does anyone need a break? Are we doing okay? Okay. So the Leica is a rangefinder, and the rangefinder refers to how it focuses. And I think, how many of you have ever had an old camera that focused in this way, where you have two views of the subject and it crosses over until it becomes in focus? That's kind of how it works. And many of us probably had these cameras I had one, I still have one. I actually have several. And the benefit to a rangefinder is, and a Leica is a rangefinder, which is why I'm talking about it, is that it allows you to hold the shutter open. So the shutter is what controls access to light into the camera. So the shutter comes up and it comes down, right? So with a rangefinder and this kind of rangefinder focusing, it allows somebody like Cartier-Bresson to shoot in low light at a much lower shutter speed. So whereas when you're using your iPhone, you can look and see what the iPhone is shooting at. You can pull it into Photoshop and go into under the file info and see. You can see all of these things. You can see what the camera settings were, even if you're using auto. It'll tell you what the ISO is. It will tell you what the shutter speed is, what the f-stop is. And so you'll find that with phones, you're shooting at very, very high shutter speeds, right? It's capturing action. But Cartier-Bresson was able to use a slower shutter speed, which allowed for an image to have some blur. So a lot of these images might have blur where there's motion. So that's something to kind of think about. It's an artistic choice when you're taking pictures. So if you're using your iPhone, it's harder to get that sort of, you'd have to actually manually set it, which you can do. But it's just something to think about, that everything we see today is very, very clear and super sharp. Well, I would argue that a lot of what we see today is over sharpened and really could use a little bit more blur. But the rangefinder was sort of revolutionary at the time. And it allowed people also like Robert Capa, who is a war photographer, to go into situations of battle and take very compelling pictures because it was light and very, very versatile. Cartier-Bresson, the man himself, with his Leica. I always love to see pictures of photographers with cameras, and there's a couple of websites that feature photographers with their cameras, and I just love that. I also want to note that Cartier-Bresson sort of looked like a photographer. They all have bags with them. They all used to wear vests where they could kind of stuff film and anything else that they need, batteries and all that kind of stuff. So there was a look to photographers. So when somebody like Cartier-Bresson was on the street, people would have recognized him, not just because of his camera, but because of what he wore as being a photojournalist or a photographer working more in reportage. So this would have been something that was very non-threatening, right? I mean, I've known Jim Powers for years, and Jim Powers used to wear the same sort of outfit. So he would wear a vest, you know, with the button-down shirt, and he'd have a bag with him all the time. So it's kind of the standard look for a photojournalist. So now I'm kind of going to move a little bit away from photojournalism, and I'm just going to examine about 3 pictures in depth, and we'll take a look at these. And does anyone want to tell me what they think is going on in this picture, or have any thoughts about this picture by Eugene Richards, who is still working today?
It's a very hot summer day in Brooklyn.
It is.
And the fire hydrants are on.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how people cool themselves off.
Right.
And if you walk around the corner, there's probably grills set up, and people will do outdoor barbecues on their stoops.
So is this a successful picture?
I think it captures a piece of urban life in a poorer neighborhood. Mm-hmm. It's obviously an industrial section too, the warehouses, you know, away from probably getting caught,
mm-hmm.
you know, opening the fire.
Okay, what else do we see in this picture? Anyone? What about the composition?
When you see the motion, you see the motion on the water, the girl that's tossing the water, and it's a great definition of it coming all the way back down
yes,
her ankle.
And what about, right, so there's a shape. Hydrant.
Yes.
Right?
The
so
hydrant starting out, the shape of that, and then the L above the dark
mm-hmm.
Ceiling, it sort of brings the picture down on that.
Yes.
Side. And the corner sort of stops it right there
mm-hmm.
with the stop sign.
The stop sign actually does stop, right? It stops us in this picture.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Diagonals everywhere.
Yes. Yeah. Geometry.
Yeah, lots of angles.
Lots of angles, and lots of angles that are not parallel.
Oh yeah, no.
Right, so we've got lots of angles that are intersecting. We have, but what, like the Singh picture that we saw earlier, do you remember I was talking about that? We've got this sort of in the upper, sort of in the mid left, we've got this space, right above the warehouse building. We've got this space of sky. So what does that do in this picture? It's very similar to Singh, who had that sort of aluminum thing behind the woman's head in that other picture. So what that does is it brings us in. This is an area of light, this very small kind of trapezoid, not trapezoid, sort of a scalene triangle, right? So that brings us right in. It also helps with the diagonals to bring us down and across this image. So we all probably look at this image slightly differently. I tend to go up and down and out. But you know, we're all a little bit different when it comes to that. But what he's done through geometry is he's taking the viewer on a little bit of a tour of this neighborhood with one picture. So, you know, as I'm sorry, I can't remember who was describing, you know, the neighborhood just when I first put this up, because I can't tell who's talking, so I'm sorry. But you described it beautifully. So we have a sense of the neighborhood. We have a sense of place, very strong sense of place. We have a very strong sense of the people who live in this place. And then it's all sort of wrapped up in this fabulous geometry that we can go back and visit again and again, and we'll probably still see more geometry in this picture. And Eugene Richards has shot extensively in Boston and in Dorchester. So he's someone that if you like this picture, I urge you to research him a little bit more and look at some of his other work. He works in color and in black and white, I think primarily in black and white. But do you think this picture would be different if it was in color? We don't know.
I like black and white is, I think, says it all.
Mm-hmm. So if we're shooting black and white, what are some of the things that we might be looking for?
Shadows?
Yeah, we're looking for contrast, light and dark.
Mhm.
What else? What else might be something that this picture has? What about the forms? It's got very strong shapes.
Mhm.
We've got the shape of the stop sign. We've got these very strong graphic elements with the fence and with the building, and another strong element going across with the L. And then we also have sort of the brick structure behind the L. So that's sort of, so that's another element that's going up and down. So there's so much going on here. But what he's done is he's taken all of these angles and he's compressed this picture into the scene. So they all sort of keep us in this picture. All of these angles are working to keep the viewer in the picture.
And the fire hydrant, I think, yeah, the fire hydrant, I think is central to this because it's a different shape, you know, the dome shape, the water coming out, and more circular.
Yeah, that's very true. And there's also there's a couple of things that happen with the fire hydrant. The fire hydrant counterbalances the stop sign, right? So this is something you might want to look for when you are composing a picture to make sure it's balanced. You have a large element in the foreground. You may need a smaller element also in the foreground or in the background to balance it. And it creates this diagonal that we visibly see with the water coming out of the hydrant. So that's really interesting. And also there's a triangle. There are many triangles happening in this picture. So you've got the stop sign to the fire hydrant, you know, to the chair in the background, the folding chair back to the stop sign, or you could even go all the way up from the fire hydrant, all the way up to that fence, all the way back to the stop sign, and then back to the fire hydrant. So there's a flow in this picture, all of those angles, and all this is like a lesson in geometry because it's all sort of here. But it just goes, it's just a great example of what you can do with a street scene that might not have the most color. He's shooting black and white. These buildings, you know, aren't maybe aesthetically pleasing, but look what he's been able to do with this situation. And we don't know if he moved these people. I don't know that much about how he made this picture, but I'm assuming they were probably kind of in their positions when he shot this.
The body shapes of the women are.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that. Thank you. Gesture. So that goes back to gesture. Gesture is super, super important. So we want people being people, right? We don't want people just standing in front of the camera smiling. We want people being themselves. And gesture is a uniquely human movement or activity. So the gestures that someone is making, there's the pot, the arms outstretched, there's the woman with her hands touching her face. You know, these are all things that we see humans do. And this is what we connect with. We connect with people being people. So that's something to look for when you're out on the street and you're making pictures. Anyone else have anything to say about this one? I think this is a great picture. I think that, you know, this is a great reference and it's just something to keep in mind. And there are many street scenes with pools like this. There's one by James Estrin that I'll show you next week. I meant to pull it for today to counterbalance this one. I was going to show you that one. But it's sort of an interesting genre. So I think what you need to do is in your own places or wherever you're shooting, what are the things that are happening? Like, what are the common things that are happening? You know, if it's summertime, you know, are there street vendors? Are there tourist buses? You know, what's happening in the area where you are? So has anyone seen this photograph before? Okay, this is Gary Winogrand, and I'm not sure when this was shot, but it's probably shot in the mid 60s. And I think this is Washington Square Park, but I could be wrong, could be Central Park. But one of the interesting things about this, well, I'm gonna have you tell me. So tell me why, is this an interesting picture? Anyone?
Yeah, it's fascinating. The three women in the middle, could have been just the photograph, but he framed it with the other couples, which is fascinating.
Excellent observation. Excellent observation. So he's got 3 couples, 3 groups of people, correct?
Mm.
So what else is happening in this picture?
Well, you've got 3 stories going on, so you sort of wonder what's going on the right. The 2 girls looking over the man who's reading the newspaper, and you've got the couple over on the far side. So you say, I would think, I wonder, what they're thinking. And then you've got all the people in the background just walking, but you can circle around. But I always like to sort of imagine, what's going on in their minds, why they're there.
And what is that? Narrative. It has narrative.
Story.
It has the elements of a story.
Absolutely.
Right? So not only does it have compelling characters, it has them in a situation where we are wondering more about them. We want to know what the story is here.
Plus, I love the legs.
Yeah, you know what? The clothes in these pictures, I'll tell you, I miss the fashion of these eras. When I sort of look at these pictures, I really wish people dressed like that. So what else do we see in this picture?
I like how the gentleman is leaning in. He's kind of opened up to her, and she's kind of leaning back a little bit. She's kind of leaning away. So he's kind of leaning in, she's leaning out. Okay, so there's this kind of like a little bit of, I don't want to say tension, but there's something more than going on than just a conversation to me in that one. And then the other one on the other side is almost the same thing, where the woman's got her hand in her hair, almost, like a lion maning up her hair, but it's an old gentleman just reading a paper. So I would have thought, the other guy would have been over there or something, but so there's just so much going on the bench, and then there's something going on behind the bench.
So we've got social dynamics happening in this picture. This is a very interesting reflection of a social interaction or various social interactions. So that's something else you can look for in your pictures. And I would suggest that you could extend that idea from social to cultural, right? So street photography is a cultural reflection of what is happening at the moment, right? So this is a snapshot of what's happening in a park at a specific place and time. And we know that this moment no longer exists, but we are still compelled by it. We still want to know what's happening. So what about the composition itself? Any more to add about the composition?
I find it interesting that, I don't know if he cropped it or if he composed the picture, but the gentleman on the right is cut in half. We don't see all of him. So
that's really interesting, right? I don't believe this is cropped. I think there are versions of pictures when you're looking for street photography that have been cropped. I always try to find the uncropped one. So Gary Winogrand is using a 35mm lens, which if we get to it today, I'll explain what that means. He's using a wide angle lens, and he's getting as much of what he sees. He is getting more through the camera than what he would see sort of with his eyes. Right? He's seeing more. He is seeing an exaggerated picture plane, which is why he can see all this. So if any of you using an iPhone, you are also seeing an exaggerated picture plane. There's always a stretching out of the picture when you're using anything that's wide. And one of the, I would say one of the charming hallmarks of street photography is the cropping of people out of the picture plane. And what does that do? Anyone?
Kind of makes you curious for what's going on outside the frame.
Mystery, surprise, right? It's like surprise again, mystery and surprise. So you have this sort of, you've got just about everything going on in this picture. You also have a very, it's all set in a compelling, in compelling diagonals, right? So we've got you know, the upper diagonal of the people in the background. We've got the bench is a diagonal. The park itself is a diagonal. And then we also have the sidewalk is a diagonal. And
you're right.
Right.
And the legs are also a diagonal.
Yes, they're going the other way. So it's bringing us down from the upper left-hand corner of the picture plane all the way down to the lower right. That's what those angles are helping to do. It's helping the eye move through the picture. And there's something else happening here. And, you know, most likely it might have been conscious on Winogrand's part. It may not have been conscious, but what we find in great art is that it refers back sometimes to art that came before it, maybe even art in antiquity. So this almost looks like a frieze.
Yes.
That you might see on a Roman or a Greek building. Yeah, so you saw that too, right?
Yeah, interesting, so interesting.
Right, so these are shapes that are in our culture, right? We have seen arrangements like that before. So sometimes, you know, we have these sort of archetypes of shape, I would call them, in our culture, and we absorb all of that. And we go out with our phones or our cameras and we go and take pictures. And what happens is those shapes sometimes surface. You know, it's because it's familiar to us. We've seen what good composition is like, sort of on an unconscious level. And when we see it in front of us, there's something that makes us snap the picture. So don't, you know, so when you're working as a street photographer, always think you're bringing your experience with you. You are bringing all of that observation that you've had in the past with you. And I think we look for things that resonate with us. And I think that means in terms of socially, what's happening in the picture and compositionally. Anything else before I move on? I love this picture, one of my favorites.
None of the people were looking at the photo. None of the people were looking at the photographer.
Okay, that's a good point. So this is not a confrontational portrait. This is purely observational, I would say. And what that means is that the subjects who, you know, Winogrand is close. So these subjects are not, they're not collaborators. We are observing them. They may have been aware of Winogrand's presence before or after. So we don't know. We don't know how many frames he shot of this. Maybe he only shot this one. Maybe he shot 10. We don't know. I'm assuming since he was shot on film that he was economizing and probably didn't shoot that many frames. So he waited. And I think that's really important, to slow down and to wait. And this is a scene, this is New York City, but you would see this in a lot of places. Parks are just a great location to kind of, you know, move through and see what's happening and see the groups of people and see if you can kind of capture some sort of tableau. This is kind of a tableau, I would say.
It's interesting to see so many people smushed together on one bench, especially after this year of like social distancing.
Cultural.
So to have so much going on one bench, it's just, yeah, to see them all so closely, but different things happening.
Absolutely, it's cultural, right? We're not going to see this today. We might, but we probably won't. So when you are going out and shooting, be aware of that, right? So you're probably going to see people who are more spread out. So that's a different kind of compositional problem. So if you look at the people in the back, in the way back, they're sort of spread out in different groups. You know, there's a lot more distance between those people. And he's managed to work that beautifully into this photo. Mm-hmm. So there are different ways that you would sort of, so you observe a situation, and then sometimes you have to sort of strategize, like what can you do with that situation? Or what can you do with that setting? I would call this like a theater set. So Winogrand probably passed this location hundreds of times. And it's just the one time he goes by and he probably noted it. He's probably like, oh, this is some place that, you know, something could happen here. And he probably, you know, visited it many times. And then this was the one day that he got this you know, masterpiece of a photograph. Anything else?
I'm so glad women don't have to wear pantyhose anymore.
I was watching some sort of movie last night, and the woman went to like a business meeting and she was wearing pantyhose. I'm like, are you kidding me? Really? I mean, it was like the show was like from 2019. I'm like, no, nobody does that. And this woman clearly is not wearing pantyhose. So this woman was shot by Helen Leavitt. And Helen Leavitt was a well-known street photographer in New York City. And when she was very young, she got a very small camera called a Kodak Brownie. It's a very small little square camera. And she would go out and shoot the children who were playing in her Brooklyn neighborhood. And she showed those pictures to a very famous photographer at the time named Walker Evans. Has anyone ever heard of Walker Evans?
Yes.
Okay, so Walker Evans, you know, is sort of the generation before Helen Leavitt. And he shot all across the country. And I can't remember the name of the book. It's The American Something is the name of his monumental book of photography. And so he was very interested in what was happening socially. He was very interested in a number of things: architecture, social movements. He also worked for the Works Progress Administration. So he was an artist for that, and went all over the country and took amazing black and white pictures all over the country. So Helen Leavitt, he was famous at this time. So Helen Leavitt, you know, was so, you know, lucky to have Walker Evans be interested in her work and take her on. So Walker Evans took her on for about 1.5 years, and they would shoot in the New York City subways together. And so here's an example of someone who was sort of trained by somebody who was much more in the formalist mode, working in street photography, but kind of using formal elements. And what do I mean by formal elements? So let's talk a little bit about this composition. What do we notice about the composition of this picture?
It's almost divided in thirds.
Yes, and a lot of pictures are, yep, vertically. And actually vertically and horizontally to me, like it's 2/3 and 1/3 and then 3 across, right? So we can look at it that way. What about that? What about that is interesting?
It's also a triangle. It's almost reminds me a little bit of the.
So we've got diagonals, right?
Not the Pietà, but the Madonna.
Interesting. Well, you see a lot of Madonna-esque imagery in street photography. I could probably do a whole session just on that alone. But she might be a street Madonna, maybe. What else do we see about, what else is of interest in this composition?
The depth of field on the left.
Yes. So how would it have been different? I next time maybe I'll do this. I hadn't thought of this. If I crop this picture and we just see the people, the woman and her children in the phone booth, you know, I mean, that's interesting. It's still interesting. But what makes this a great picture is that we see what else is happening around. We see other glimpses of society and the culture. So this is a very good illustration of using what's happening socially in a picture. So we see the people on the motorbike. We see the woman on the right who looks like has some bags. We see a bus. So we know this is bustling. So we know the street is crowded probably. On the right-hand side, the street looks very crowded. So that sort of, you know, kind of makes this composition even more compact when we see them. What else about this composition?
There's
foreground. Oops, sorry.
No, I was going to say there's a lot of texture.
Yes. There's pattern. We've got pattern.
The tar, her dress, all very different textures.
But that pattern of the gum and stuff in the sidewalk is picking up on the pattern that's in her dress.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a connection. And those are also connected to the woman on the right, who also has polka dots in her dress, right? So these are things that Helen probably didn't do consciously, but like a very observant person and a street photographer who's been doing this a while, just realized that there was something in this, and it needed to be shot the way, you know, at that very moment. So what else do we see in this picture? Anything else?
You also have sort of a polka dots going down the street, the white blocks, and it goes over toward the scooter, over the beer bottle laying there.
Yep. Absolutely.
More of the theme of the polka dots, and actually past the scooter too.
Mm-hmm.
I see foreground, midground, and background. And I think it's interesting that there's no sky.
Yep, no sky. What does that do? What does that do? Very good observation. What does that do to this picture?
Compresses it.
Yes.
Photograph.
So what does compression do to a scene like this? It exaggerates that feeling of tightness, right?
Yeah.
Because we've got the open space at the bottom. So as we are looking from the point of view of the photographer, and the photographer has the space. But going forward, really, there's not much space. So it's compressed because we don't have that sky. And what else is doing the compression here?
Well, the family is compressed in the phone booth.
By two parallel lines, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, kind of, there's a third parallel too. So you've got those parallel lines, almost like an elevator, like doors closing. You kind of almost feel like there's doors are going to close on that.
Yeah.
So you've got all this geometry that is exaggerating the subject, and the subject of this is compression. So what about the little girl who's looking at us?
Oh, well, that's fascinating.
So,
well, it's a boy or girl. It looks to me like it's a boy. Is he drawing us, his face drawing us in to the phone booth?
Yes,
out of the phone booth. I don't know.
For a couple of different reasons. We're going into that phone booth. One, because it's compressed and our eye is sort of going to that compression because we're being guided by those two parallel lines that are just making us go there, and by the diagonals that are leading us there. And then we have a subject who is dressed in white, and then there's a white bag around that subject's head. So what does that do? White comes forward, right? So those, you know, absence of shadow, anything light is going to bring that element forward. So our eyes go to that. So it's kind of a stroke of genius that, you know, Leavitt got with this. So with the light colored dress and the white bag, we are going right, she is bringing us by the hand right into that phone booth.
Mm-hmm. But I also like the way she uses yellow. You know, if she used any more, it would be too much. But she's just got these little touches of yellow around the outer edges of the
right. And you could even sort of, you know, you've got the little boy, right? You've got the paint along the sidewalk. You've got the yellow on the motorbike, the yellow of the street lights, of the traffic lights in the upper left. Yeah. And then if you go to the upper right, you've got the crosswalk sign that's also yellow. And then you've got this woman who, you know, has flesh tone. So it's building a triangle almost, you know, leading us around this picture. So, you know, something like that, when that happens, I think it's Leavitt sort of intuiting. It's an intuition on her part. She has done a lot of this kind of photography. So she has an intuition about the scene, and she may not actually see what's happening when she's looking through the camera, but she knows something's there. She may not have noticed all of these things until after, you know, till she was processing it and she was looking at the negatives. You know, a lot of times when we're out in the street, we're working quickly or intuitively, and we just know a scene is good. And I would argue that she knew that this was a situation where something could happen, right? Something really interesting could happen. Or again, like Winogrand, she probably walked by this many times, or many phone booths, and saw similar things happening. And this was just the one day that she happened to be at the right place at the right time. So, you know, street photographers are outside all the time.